Listen. I am Mama Otomba, and in Harlem, I have seen things that do not belong to the daylight world, things that sit between the trumpet notes of a broken jazz melody and the whisper of ancestors who refuse to sleep. And I tell you this not as a tale to entertain, but as a burden I carry in my bones, like the weight of old river stones from a homeland across the ocean where spirits walk freely among the baobab trees and speak in winds that only the chosen can hear. It was the summer of 1957 when the air in Harlem grew thick with music and something else, something older than music, something that listened back when the musicians played too deeply into their sorrow. And I remember the night the Velvet Lantern Club opened its doors again after 20 years of silence, because that was the night everything changed for me. The Velvet Lantern was once the pride of 142nd Street, where men in sharp suits and women in silk dresses danced like they were trying to outrun their own shadows, and the trumpet player they called Elijah Graves was the soul of that place, a man whose music could make even the broken-hearted forget their names. But Elijah died 20 years earlier in a fire that swallowed the old stage and left nothing but ash and a burned trumpet that no one could ever bring themselves to throw away. Yet on that night in 1957, as I sat in my small apartment above a bakery that always smelled of burnt sugar and cinnamon, I heard the sound of a trumpet drifting through the cracks of my window, soft at first like a memory trying to remember itself, then louder, aching. Alive, impossible, because I knew that sound. I had wept to that sound, and I had stood at Elijah Graves' funeral when they lowered his casket into the ground, while the city pretended not to listen. My hands began to shake before my mind could explain what my heart already feared, and I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and went downstairs into the Harlem night, where the streetlights flickered like uncertain spirits, and every step I took toward the Velvet Lantern felt like stepping deeper into a dream that did not want me to wake. Outside the club, people were already gathering, drawn by the music like moths to a flame, but there was something strange about them, something hollow in their eyes, as if they were listening but not fully alive. And when I pushed through the heavy red doors, the smell of old smoke and rum and iron rushed out to greet me like a forgotten memory returning too quickly. The club was alive again, but not with living joy. It was alive, like a body remembering how to breathe after drowning. And there on the stage stood a man under a single golden light, his back turned to the crowd, his trumpet raised to his lips, and even before he turned, I knew it was Elijah Graves, because the air itself seemed to bow toward him, because the shadows on the wall trembled as if afraid to look directly at him. When he finally turned, the years fell away from him like dust, and yet they did not leave him whole either, because his eyes carried a depth that no living man should have, as if he had seen the place where sound is born before it becomes music, and the place where silence goes when it dies. The crowd did not scream, they did not question. They only swayed gently as if under a spell they had always known, and Elijah began to play a melody I had never heard but somehow recognized in my blood. A melody that spoke of deserts where spirits walk without shadows and rivers that flow backward into the past. A melody that carried the names of forgotten ancestors who once called my family line by firelight in lands I had only seen in dream. I felt my grandmother's voice rise in my memory, the old woman who taught me the ways of protection and warning, who told me that not all who return are meant to be welcomed, and as Elijah played I saw faint outlines of figures behind him on the stage. Tall shapes made of smoke and bone and memory, moving in rhythm with the music like they were feeding on it. The air grew heavier and I could feel something pulling at me, not toward the stage, but away from it, as if the city itself was trying to warn me that what I was witnessing was not a miracle, but a crossing, a breach between worlds that should never have been opened again. I wanted to run, but my feet refused, because there was sorrow in that music so deep it felt like my own sorrow had been waiting its whole life to hear it played back to me. And when Elijah finally lowered his trumpet, the last note lingered in the air like a question no one wanted answered, and then he spoke my name without ever looking at me, saying, "Mama Otomba, you remember what was buried should not be called back." And in that moment I understood that the fire that killed Elijah Graves had not been an accident at all, and that whatever had returned wearing his face had not come back alone. He did not move after saying my name, yet the sound of it still lingered in the room like smoke that refuses to leave, even when the fire has died, and I felt every eye in that club turn toward me, though no one truly turned their heads. as if the music itself had decided I was now part of the stage, part of the performance, part of whatever ritual was unfolding under that trembling golden light. I wanted to deny what I had heard, to tell myself it was the trick of grief or memory, but Elijah Graves slowly raised his trumpet again, and began to play a softer tune, this time one that did not pull at the body, but at the soul. And with each note I saw the air around him ripple like water disturbed by something rising from beneath it. The figures behind him grew clearer now, no longer smoke but outlines of people who had once lived. Their faces half-formed as if the world had forgotten how to finish remembering them, and I knew then what my grandmother had warned me about when she spoke of the desert spirits that wander when the drum is played backward, when the dead are called not with respect but with desperation. The velvet lantern itself seemed to change as I watched the walls stretching subtly like skin pulled over bone, the chandeliers flickering between gold light and something colder, something that belonged to no earthly flame, and I realized with a tightening in my chest that the club was not simply a place tonight, it was a boundary, a thin cloth separating Harlem from somewhere older and far less forgiving. A man near the bar began to laugh softly, but the sound cracked midway and turned into a cough that sounded too hollow. And when I looked at him more closely, I saw his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles did not match his movements, as if his reflection was slightly delayed, learning how to imitate him, rather than belonging to him. Elijah's music shifted again deeper now, and I felt it press against my memories, forcing images into my mind that were not my own images of fire swallowing wood, of a stage collapsing inward, of hands reaching through smoke as if trying to hold on to something already taken. And I understood that the fire 20 years ago had not destroyed Elijah Graves, it had opened something inside him, something that should have remained sealed. I stepped forward against my own hesitation, my shawl tightening around me as though it had weight beyond fabric, and I spoke into the room, though my voice felt small compared to the music, asking him what he wanted, asking him why he had returned, and Elijah lowered his trumpet slightly, just enough for the melody to fracture. And in that fracture I heard a second voice layered beneath his, a voice like sand shifting in a buried tomb, answering that he had not returned alone because no one ever crosses back without something crossing with them. The crowd swayed more intensely now, their faces becoming distant, their eyes reflecting not the stage, but something far beyond it, and I saw thin lines of light connecting them all like invisible threads, binding them to the rhythm, feeding into it, sustaining it, and I understood with rising dread that the music was not being played for them. It was being played through them. I reached into my pocket and touched the small carved bone my grandmother had given me before she died, a charm against calling spirits that were not meant to stay in this world. And I whispered the old words under my breath, feeling the air around me resist as if the room itself did not want protection to exist inside it. Elijah's eyes finally met mine then, and I saw something behind them that was not hatred, not even malice, but exhaustion, as if whatever wore him had been carrying the weight of return for too long, and could no longer distinguish between punishment and purpose. The trumpet fell silent abruptly, and in that silence the entire club seemed to inhale at once a collective breath that did not belong to the living alone, and from the corners of the room I saw the shadows begin to move independently, peeling themselves away from walls and corners, like they were finally unfastening themselves from the world that had been holding them. One of them stepped closer to me, and I recognized the shape of a woman I had once seen in a photograph of old Harlem musicians, a singer who had vanished without explanation, decades ago, her mouth opening as if trying to speak but only releasing a faint echo of melody. And I knew then that the velvet lantern was not merely reopened, it was reopening those who had been lost within its history, pulling them back through sound like fishermen pulling nets through dark water. Elijah lifted his trumpet again but did not play, and instead he spoke quietly, telling me that the fire had not killed him because he had struck a bargain in the final moment. A bargain not with God but with something older, that lives in the spaces between notes, something that feeds on unfinished music and unspoken endings. And that bargain had required him to return when the door between worlds grew thin enough again. The air around us grew colder, and I felt the bone charm in my hand begin to warm as if reacting to unseen pressure. And I realized the door he spoke of was not opening from outside, but from within the music itself, each note widening it, each silence weakening it, and that if the song reached its completion, Something far worse than Elijah Graves would step fully into Harlem and claim the night as its own. And as I stood there in the trembling light surrounded by people who were no longer fully present, I understood that I had already crossed too far into whatever this was, because the music had begun to recognize me as part of its memory, and memories once awakened never return quietly. I am Mama Otomba, and in that moment when the music itself seemed to breathe around me like a living thing with hunger in its lungs, I understood that silence was the only instrument left that could still break the spell. But silence in a place like the Velvet Lantern was not something you simply created. It had to be taken, wrestled from the air like a spirit refusing to release its grip on the living world. Elijah Graves stood on that stage holding his trumpet without playing, and yet I could feel the unfinished melody still vibrating through the walls, through the bodies of the people who were no longer fully people. And I knew if even a single note returned, the door he had spoken of would not just open wider, it would become permanent. I stepped forward again, though every instinct in me screamed to run, and I raised my voice, not in fear, but in command, calling on the names my grandmother had taught me, names that do not belong to language alone, but to memory older than blood. And as I spoke them, I felt the bone charm in my hand crack slightly, as if something immense on the other side of the room had turned its attention fully toward me. The shadows that had peeled away from the corners now gathered closer, no longer random shapes, but a congregation of unfinished lives. And among them I saw not only musicians and singers, but people whose stories had been erased long before they ever reached a stage, men and women, from deserts and rivers and cities that no longer exist on maps, all pulled here by a music that did not know how to stop remembering. Elijah's face twisted with something like pain when I spoke the final name, not his own, but the name of what had entered him in the fire 20 years ago. And for the first time the air around him faltered, as if the thing inside him had blinked. He told me then, in a voice layered with both exhaustion and echo, that it had offered him return because he was the perfect vessel, a musician whose grief had always been louder than his fear, and that every performance since his return was not a concert, but a widening of the passage, each note a nail pulled from the wall between worlds. The crowd began to collapse inward slowly, not falling but dissolving into the rhythm itself, their outlines thinning like ink washed away by unseen rain. And I realized the truth too late and too clearly, that the Velvet Lantern was not feeding on them alone, it was converting them into continuation, turning human presence into eternal sound. I pressed my palm against the floor and whispered the grounding prayer my grandmother used when calling spirits back into rest, and the wood beneath me grew warm, responding like soil, remembering rain. And for the first time the room resisted the music instead of obeying it. Elijah lifted his trumpet again, but this time I saw hesitation in the movement, a fracture in obedience, and I spoke directly to him. Not to the thing inside him, but to the man who had once burned and chosen wrongly in his final breath, telling him that no music is worth an eternity of borrowed souls, that even grief must end where life ends, or it becomes something that eats both. His eyes trembled, and for a moment I saw the young musician he had been, the one who once made Harlem dance instead of drown now. And I saw his hand begin to lower the trumpet, but behind him the shadows surged in anger, pressing forward like a tide denied its shore, and the room screamed without sound. That was when I broke the bone charm fully, crushing it in my fist until the dust of it fell onto the floor like pale ash, and I spoke the final binding word, not taught but inherited in dream and blood. And the air snapped as if the world itself had been struck at its seam. The Velvet Lantern shuddered violently, the golden light flickering between existence and absence, and the figures around us began to unravel upward like smoke pulled back into the sky, and I felt the pull of them trying to take me too, trying to fold my name into their unfinished chorus. But I held my ground because someone had to remain where memory still belonged to the living. Elijah screamed then, not in anger but in release. And in that sound I heard both the man and the thing inside him separating for the first time, like two currents finally forced apart after too long flowing together. And the trumpet fell from his hands as the final note he never played collapsed into silence. The club did not explode or burn, it simply emptied itself of what it should never have held, and when the light finally steadied again, I was standing alone in a room that looked older than it had before, as if decades had been returned to their rightful place in a single breath. Elijah Graves was gone, not as he had been in death, not as he had been in return, But as something finally released from a loop, it was never meant to carry, and on the stage lay only the burned trumpet from the original fire, cold and ordinary once more. Outside, Harlem continued as if nothing had happened. Jazz still drifting from distant clubs, laughter still moving through the streets. But I knew that somewhere beneath the rhythm of the city, there is always a second rhythm listening, waiting for those who try to call back what has already been allowed to leave. And I tell you now as Mama Otomba that some music is not meant to be played twice, because the first time is life, and the second time is always something else pretending to remember it.